4 centuries ago, brother fought brother in the English Civil War. This is the earliest surviving war memorial in Britain, marking where a royalist commander fell at the height of that conflict. It pitted king against parliament in a fight over issues that are still with us, about the legacy of Magna Carta, about freedom and representation. Where do we come from? And where are we going? Is life just a meaningless journey, punctuated only by chance encounters and things of no lasting significance? Does it matter that we follow one road rather than another? This series asks those questions of the nation which gave birth to Magna Carta and exported its ideals across the globe, England. How did Magna Carta come about? What were its effects, and what inheritance has it left behind? It's a journey that, with the benefit of hindsight, we may be tempted to think straightforward. Yet to those who lived through it, it seemed anything but.
Duly anointed.
We'll examine watersheds in politics, science,
the happier we shall be,
society,
of which the acute,
law, and warfare, to tease out what was different about the English experience. What was it that gave rise to such groundbreaking ideas and radical new ways of ordering society? Concepts and institutions which over the years have been widely admired and copied, and almost as often derided and shunned. What was it that helped deliver battlefield success time and again against all odds? These things matter just as much in the present as they ever did in years gone by. They matter because ideas matter, because ideas and institutions shape societies, and societies shape those who live in them. We'll be looking at the ideas that shaped England and her people, and through them, the world. Our story starts here, in a low-lying field by the banks of the River Thames. A rather ordinary field, set in a typical southern English landscape. Yet, almost 800 years ago, something altogether remarkable happened close to where I'm now standing. Here, one of the most influential documents in human history was sealed. Magna Carta, the Great Charter. Together with habeas corpus and the Bill of Rights, it's commonly reckoned one of the 3 cornerstones of English liberty, a totem of freedom, not only in the land which gave it birth, but throughout the world. The choice of this particular location was no accident. The people who met to witness the sealing of the Charter on 15th June 1215 were armed to the teeth and deeply suspicious of each other. A disgruntled King John on one side, a group of rebellious barons on the other. Senior churchmen, ostensibly at least, as mediators. Runnymede was neutral ground.
He's a sly fox.
Fitzwalter?
Lord Archbishop? Will he come?
Presently. He has no choice.
Yet there was deeper significance to this place too, harking back to a former age and hallowed usage. The name Runnymede comes from two Anglo-Saxon words meaning meeting and meadow. 4 centuries before Magna Carta was sealed, this was where Alfred the Great, the West Saxon king who saved England from being completely overrun by Viking armies from Denmark, had from time to time convened his great council, the Witan. The symbolism was not lost on later generations. A time would come when Englishmen seeking to make sense of their civil war would characterize it as having been fought to win freedom from a Norman yoke, for liberties which they traced back from before Magna Carta to the first migrations of Angles, Saxons and Jutes to these islands. They saw the Charter as confirmation that their fight had been just. But how exactly did this document come about? Or what exactly did it say? To find out, I've come here to Salisbury Cathedral because this is where one of the best copies of Magna Carta is kept. Here is the Charter. Originally, it would have borne the great seal of the king himself, John Lackland, youngest of the 4 sons of Henry II by the tempestuous Eleanor of Aquitaine. Grasping and rapacious, a threat to the nobility every bit as much as to common folk, John had progressively lost the trust of his most powerful vassals. But even that would perhaps not have cost him their loyalty had he not been disastrously unsuccessful in one of the primary duties of medieval kings: warfare. Following the Battle of Bouvines in northern France the year before Magna Carta, John lost huge swathes of his continental inheritance to the wily French monarch, Philip II. Those losses weren't only heavy blows for King John, they were just as keenly felt by his barons, the majority of whom held lands in France as well as in England. When they arrived at Runnymede, they were in no mood to forgive the greed, misgovernment and injustices of someone who'd cost them so dear. They wanted cast-iron assurances that their traditional rights would be upheld. And that's why they insisted that John seal the Charter.
Is there nothing to offer me?
Nothing, sire.
Have you no castle taken? No fresh troops from the north?
You must sign the Charter, my liege.
Must! We know not must. Why do not these barons, with their unjust exactions, ask my entire kingdom?
My lord, there is no more time.
The rebellious barons John was talking about weren't minor lords. They were among the greatest magnates of the day, including 8 who were earls or heirs to earldoms. And their names are telling. Names like d'Aubigny, de Boon, de Clare, Fitzwalter, de Mandeville, de Vere. These men were overwhelmingly of Norman or French ancestry. One of the ironies of the Charter is that the barons who demanded it were anything but champions of the people.
He is here.
They were part of an alien governing class which had forcibly dispossessed the Saxons in the wake of the Norman conquest. And what they put their names to was no Democrat's manifesto. For sure, there are provisions relating to the prompt and impartial administration of justice, coupled with promises that the king will make good any past misdeeds and not introduce new forms of taxation without the barons' consent. For the most part, though, the Charter's 63 clauses focused narrowly on the concerns of a small elite. Its primary aims were to define, and by defining, to limit, the feudal rights of the crown, and also to protect the privileges of the church. A church, by the way, which had done much to stiffen baronial resolve and to bring Magna Carta about. One of the prime movers behind the scenes was Archbishop of Canterbury Stephen Langton, the most senior churchman in England. He unearthed a helpful precedent, the so-called Coronation Charter, which Henry I had issued almost a century earlier. This was the template Langton used to embed his own concerns at the heart of Magna Carta. Freedom for the church, an end to the sale of justice, and due process of law, provisions that remain on the statute book today. But what Langton conceived was still very much for the elite. So how did this document mutate into a charter for the common man? The nub of it is here in clause 39.
No free man shall be seized or imprisoned, or stripped of his rights or possessions, or outlawed or exiled, or deprived of his standing in any other way, nor will we proceed with force against him, or send others to do so, except by the lawful judgment of his equals, or by the law of the land.
This was political dynamite because it meant that the law stood above the will of the king. And these same provisions would be used to argue that power was exercised with the consent of the people, not in spite of them.
Here, my liege.
By placing a brake on the unfettered exercise of royal authority, Magna Carta became a bulwark against all oppression, helping to secure for Englishmen an unprecedented degree of freedom from arbitrary rule. What the Charter says remains relevant to this very day because it goes to the heart of the relationship between citizen and state. That begs the question, why? Why did Magna Carta survive and grow into something with a force and reach that the people who made the king put his name to it never envisaged? Was it just chance, or was something more than that at work? It's doubtful that John intended to honour the humiliating terms that had been forced on him at Runnymede. Hardly was the ink on the charter dry before he wrote secretly to the Pope, asking to be released from his promises on the grounds that they'd been made under duress. As soon as he had that papal assurance in his pocket, he then set about building up his army and taking the castles of those who opposed him. But his plans never came to fruition. At midnight, during a violent storm on 19th October 1216, just shy of his 50th birthday, and less than a year after Magna Carta had been sealed, King John died of dysentery at Newark Castle. Some say in the southwest tower, others here in the gatehouse.
Few lamented his passing. His eldest son was crowned Henry III, but he was only a boy of 9, so the country was ruled by 2 regents, Hubert de Burgh and William the Marshal.
Almost certainly we have John's death and his son's youth to thank for the fact that Magna Carta didn't only survive, but became an entrenched part of the English political landscape. John's tomb, ornate, imposing, his effigy showing a repose he seldom knew in life. His death changed everything. Less than a month after Henry III was crowned, Magna Carta was reissued in the new king's name, this time with the Pope's approval. Late in Henry III's long reign, the very first true English Parliament was called by Simon de Montfort, and under Henry's son and successor, Edward I, an amendment to Magna Carta formally established the principle of no taxation without representation.
This legacy of the rule of law, of the right to a fair trial, of the fact that Parliament should have a say in the making of legislation and the levying of taxes, of the fact that there should be limits on royal power, was of massive importance. But it wasn't uncontested, either at the time or in the centuries that followed. These were the issues over which England fought her civil war in the 1640s. It's not fanciful to think that if that conflict had turned out differently, Magna Carta might now be no more than an obscure footnote of history, and our world might look very different. It was no accident that the monarch at the time of the English Civil War was of Scots descent. Charles I was son of James Stuart. Already king in Scotland, he'd also become ruler of England on the death of Elizabeth I in 1603. The Great Charter didn't apply in Scotland, and neither James nor his son saw reason to be bound by it south of the border.
In the shadow of these walls, Charles I took a fateful step in the long tussle with Parliament that smouldered throughout his reign and then burst into flame here on 22nd August 1642. This was where he threw down the gauntlet to his opponents as he raised his standard and called supporters to his colours.
It was a signal that talking was over, that the king had no mind to make concessions to anyone, and that if the supporters of Parliament thought differently, their only recourse was armed rebellion. Charles had treated Magna Carta as though it didn't exist, failing to call Parliament for 11 years as he instituted personal rule without any input from the people's elected representatives. He brooked no limit at all on his right to govern as he pleased.
Charles was an ardent proponent of the political theory known as the divine right of kings. In many ways, it was the antithesis of everything that Magna Carta had come to stand for in the centuries since the Charter had first been sealed. According to Charles, kings were appointed by God and were answerable to him alone. The way he saw it was this:
For the people, and I truly desire their liberty and freedom as much as anybody, but I must tell you that their liberty and freedom consists in having the government of those laws by which their life and goods may be most their own. 'Tis not by having a share in government that is nothing pertaining to 'em. A subject and a sovereign are clean different things.
Here, in the Palace of Westminster, Parliament took a very different tack, standing on its accumulated privileges and guarding with special jealousy its right to vote taxes. Throughout the 1630s and into the first years of the following decade, monarch and Parliament conducted an increasingly ill-tempered debate over issues of raw power. Power to appoint ministers, power over policy, and power over the purse strings. Step by step, this led them to war. The English Civil War cost the lives of perhaps as many as 1 in 20 of all Englishmen, man, woman, and child. Proportionate to population, that's equivalent to 3 million deaths today. It split families and divided communities. It was a fight to prevent the development in England of an absolute monarchy of the kind that Louis XIV came to embody in France only a few decades later. The Sun King famously pronounced, "L'État, c'est moi. I am the state." Those who took up arms against Charles I knew they didn't share that vision. They were in no doubt that Charles was behaving like a tyrant, but they were much less clear about what they'd put in its place. As Oliver Cromwell commented before hostilities began, "I can tell you, sirs, what I would not have, though I cannot what I would." In a sense, this was the problem with Magna Carta. It could be used to stop a king abusing his power, but did it have a positive alternative to offer? Even after all the controversies of the 1630s and 4 years of bloody civil war, no one seemed to know. The Roundheads had beaten the king. They had him a prisoner, but they didn't know what to do with their victory. The new model army, that superbly disciplined force which had cut the royalists to pieces at Naseby just 2 years beforehand, was on the verge of mutiny. And in the autumn of 1647, it was camped round here, less than 5 miles as the crow flies from the Houses of Parliament at Westminster. The bridge didn't exist then, but even so, a troop of cavalry could have been knocking at the doors of the House of Commons within an hour. There was a very real danger of military takeover. It didn't happen. To forestall further unrest, the Parliamentary High Command did something absolutely extraordinary. They invited every regiment of the new model army to send 2 men here to what was, in effect, a constitutional conference. No army in history had ever seen anything like it before. And here's where they met. The inside of this church has been modernized, but even so, we can get a real flavor of what these army debates must have been like.
Through this door to chair them came Old Ironsides, Lieutenant General Oliver Cromwell, commander of the Parliamentary Cavalry, and at his side, his son-in-law, Commissary General Henry Ireton, one of the leading lights of the new regime.
Take your seats, gentlemen, please. I call this meeting of the General Council of the Army to order at Putney on the 29th day of October in the year of our Lord, 1647. Let us begin by having read to us the document known as the Agreement of the People.
That the people of England, being at this day very unequally distributed by counties, cities and boroughs for the election of their deputies in Parliament, ought to be proportioned according to the number of inhabitants.
If this is to mean that every man is to have an equal voice in the election of representatives, then I have something to say against it.
They spent just over 2 weeks closeted with the delegates from the various regiments, first here, then in lodgings nearby, debating what the future governance of the nation should look like. It wasn't just the fact of these army debates which was amazing, it was what was said as well. Because here, a century and more before their time, men argued for things that have since become an accepted part of the English political landscape. The right to vote for all Englishmen, regular parliaments, religious toleration. In doing so, they were articulating their idea of what they'd been fighting for and what it meant to be an Englishman. One statement, more than any other, has come to sum up the spirit of those days, spoken by Colonel Rainsborough.
If a man be good enough to fight and shed his blood, tell me why this may not be. For really, I think the poorest he that is in England has a life to live as the greatest he. And therefore, truly, sir, I think it's clear that every man that is to live under a government ought first, by his own consent, to put himself under that government. And I do think the poorest man in England is not at all bound, in a strict sense, to that government he's not had a voice to put himself under.
This was revolutionary language. What Rainsborough was saying was that government depended on the consent of the governed. It was a throwback to Clause 39 of Magna Carta, and a viewpoint diametrically opposed to the one Charles I held. Ideas like this didn't just come out of thin air. They drew on and tapped into three of the most powerful and emotive elements of Englishness.
Magna Carta, Anglo-Saxon traditions like the principle that the law should apply to the king as well as to his subjects. And this book, the Bible. The Puritans who'd fought at Cromwell's side in the New Model Army, able to read the Bible in English as a result of the Protestant Reformation, looked to Scripture for guidance about how to order the kingdom, just as they looked to it to steer everyday life. In the very first book of the Old Testament, they read this.
So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them.
The soldiers who came here argued from this and other biblical texts that there should be democracy based on one man, one vote. For, they said, it was obvious from the wording in Genesis that no man was born to have dominion over another, and all were of equal worth in the sight of God. Responding to the argument that only those who owned property should be allowed to vote, former grocer's apprentice Captain Edward Sexby spoke up indignantly.
We have engaged in this kingdom and ventured our lives, and it was all for this, to recover our birthrights and privileges as Englishmen. But according to what some say, there are none. There are many thousands of us soldiers that risked our lives. We have no property, yet we have a birthright. But it seems that now, except a man has a fixed estate in this kingdom, he has no right in this kingdom. I wonder we were so much deceived. If we had not a right to the kingdom, we were mere mercenary soldiers. I tell you this, I am resolved to give my birthright to no one. Whatever may come in the way, and whatever be thought, I will give it to none. Poor soldiers like us fought for the preservation of this kingdom. And now we demand the birthright for which we fought, with the law of God and the law of our conscience with us.
As far as thousands of common soldiers were concerned, this was what they'd been fighting for. Even Cromwell, who started out sceptical, began to be swayed by the compelling nature of the arguments. He was neither the first nor the last Englishman to be confronted by the radical message of Scripture. For the army debates show that the Western world's impetus towards democracy is not ultimately rooted in the example of ancient Greece, but in half-remembered Anglo-Saxon customs of freedom and self-government, stiffened by Magna Carta and given extra force by the Bible. The men who came here in 1647 were motivated by something which gradually forced itself on the consciousness of a nation. Biblical teaching left no logical choice but to do away with property qualifications for the right to vote, to extend the franchise first to all adult males and then to women, and to allow freedom of religion. Like it or not, it was there in black and white, and in the final analysis could not be gainsaid by a nation which self-consciously described itself as Christian.
Of course, such revolutionary concepts didn't find immediate acceptance even in the society which spawned them. Cromwell's son-in-law, Henry Ireton, for one, argued furiously against them during the army debates.
There was a long, hard road to travel towards the kind of representative government we enjoy now. Difficult choices lay ahead, and this place, the only remaining part of the former Palace of Whitehall, was the scene of one of the most tragic.
Here, on the bitterly cold morning of Tuesday, 30th January 1649, Charles I was executed. He went bravely to his death, wearing 2 shirts so that no one would think he shivered from fear. Many in the army had urged his killing, blaming him for starting the Second Civil War, which broke out in 1648, and believing him such a man of blood that there could be no lasting peace as long as he lived. Cromwell called his death a cruel necessity.
It might have seemed at this point as though the contest between executive authority and Parliament had been decisively decided in favour of the latter. But it was not so. Through the twists and turns of Commonwealth, Protectorate and Restoration, that essential question remained in the balance. Would it be the forces of revolution or of reaction which held sway? It was by no means a foregone conclusion that the die would fall as it did. As a young man of 21, the dead king's eldest son, the future Charles II, watched from this cathedral tower as the Battle of Worcester unfolded below on 3rd September 1651. His defeat by Cromwell that day marked the end of royalist attempts to overthrow the parliamentary regime by force and caused the young prince to beat a hasty retreat as the new model army closed for the kill.
It was a race against time. At first, Charles headed to the house where he'd lodged for several days before the battle.
But as it dawned on him that the royalist cause was completely lost, he realised that his only chance was to flee. There was hardly enough time even to gather a few meagre possessions. The memory of this desperate game of hide and seek stayed with Charles all his life long and coloured all his actions from that point onwards. when at last he returned from exile as king at the restoration of the monarchy 9 years later, he was determined, as he put it, never to go on my travels again. He was equally determined to squeeze every last drop of pleasure out of each fleeting moment. Not for nothing was he known as the Merry Monarch, fond of horse racing and gambling, not to mention wine, women, and song. Cheers. Old habits and old ideas died hard, though, even for a man who once hid in an oak tree to escape his pursuers. Once Charles had consolidated his position and assured himself of enough revenue, he was quick to dissolve Parliament. It was an uncomfortable echo of his father's attitude towards the people's elected representatives. It's a reminder of what was at stake during the Civil War and how fragile the legacy of Magna Carta remained. This is Fort Royal Hill in Worcester, named for the stronghold that stood on this spot during the 1651 battle. Over 100 years after the fighting was over, two future presidents of the United States came to visit, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. Shocked that locals paid so little heed to the great events that had been fought out here, Adams wrote,
"And do Englishmen so soon forget the ground where liberty was fought for? Tell your neighbors and your children that this is holy ground, much holier than that on which your churches stand. All England should come in pilgrimage to this hill once a year."
When Charles II died in 1685 at the age of 55, he was buried here in Westminster Abbey. It's impossible now to know the extent to which he might have tried to turn back the clock and emulate his father had he lived longer and felt more securely in power. But what came after him left little room for doubt. Charles was succeeded by this man, his brother, James. Like his sibling, James had been deeply scarred by the experiences of his youth and his father's execution. Unlike him, he was openly Roman Catholic. Charles II had only been officially received into the Roman Catholic Church on his deathbed. Perhaps James was less devious than his brother, or simply less cautious. At the very least, this statue of him dressed as a Roman emperor betrays a fatal blindness to how others might interpret its imperial symbolism and nod to Rome. And he quickly awakened painful memories through high-handed treatment of his subjects. In just 3 short years on the throne, James managed to alienate many of the most powerful people in the realm. In 1686, he set up a standing army of 13,000 men and quartered them at Hounslow, 11 miles west of London. In the same year, he took the first steps towards the official restoration of Roman Catholicism. And 2 years later, the Declaration of Indulgence suspended all laws against Catholics and nonconformists. To many, it looked like he was preparing the ground for a Catholic takeover. Distrust of the king and suspicion of his intentions grew, to the point when insurrection was in the air once more. The last straw was an event that had seemed improbable when James first came to the throne at the age of 52 with no sons, his 2 Protestant daughters by a previous marriage, then already in their 20s. His new wife gave birth to a boy. The arrival of the infant Prince James Edward Francis on 10th June 1688 opened the floodgates. Now, a Roman Catholic was first in the line of succession. The establishment of the Church of England wasn't prepared to stand for that. Neither was Parliament about to sit on its hands, while soldiers were positioned threateningly close with the evident intent of ensuring their future compliance and whittling away their hard-won power. But James just didn't seem to know when to stop. The very same month that his new child was born, he had 7 bishops, amongst them Archbishop of Canterbury, William Sancroft, charged with seditious libel for presenting a petition stating that no English king had unilateral power to suspend an Act of Parliament. It was a put-up job, a calculated and deliberate piece of provocation, and the king obligingly blundered straight into the trap. The ground on which the bishops chose to fight was a dubious one. The Act whose suspension they complained about denied government jobs to anyone other than members of the Church of England. Yet whatever the rights and wrongs of it, James had shown his hand clearly. He was effectively claiming the power to make and unmake laws at will. It was like tearing up Magna Carta and willfully trashing the accumulated freedoms of centuries. Clearly, something would have to be done, and quickly. It took one more turn of the wheel to provide the constitutional settlement that, broadly speaking, still applies today. Its beneficiaries called it the Glorious Revolution, and it began here, at Brixham, in the southwest.
A large flotilla gathered off this part of the Devon coast on 5th November 1688. Among the 4,000 horse and 11,000 foot who disembarked that day was a thick-set Dutchman of medium height, just about to celebrate his 38th birthday. Close to this spot, he proclaimed, "The liberties of England and the Protestant religion I will maintain." His name was William, Prince of Orange, ruler of the Netherlands, and his troops set off up this hill to make camp. To this very day, this road has the name Overgang, from the Dutch word meaning passage.
William's landing met no resistance because he was here by invitation. Goaded beyond endurance by James's intemperate behaviour, a number of prominent Protestant noblemen had offered the English crown to a foreigner.
It was illegal. Treason. Hard-headed politics.
As William advanced on London, he was greeted warmly. James lost his nerve and fled for France. His enemies said he'd abdicated, leaving the throne vacant for the invader. It was patent nonsense, and even the fact that William's wife Mary, though Protestant, was James's daughter, could scarcely disguise the fact. But as so often, possession proved to be 9/10 of the law. When James sought to make a comeback with French help, it came to nothing. His throne was lost. From now on, William and Mary were to rule jointly until Mary's death in 1694 left William to reign alone for the last 8 years of his life.
The joint monarchy was unique, and so were the terms on which the crown had been offered in the first place. Royal prerogative powers were curtailed, and there was to be a new era of freedom. Freedom from laws and taxes passed without the consent of Parliament, freedom to elect members of Parliament, and freedom of speech. Charles II's Licensing Act of 1662, which prohibited the printing of any work without government permission, was to be a thing of the past. Crucially, instead of the Crown being able to levy customs and excise dues, major sources of revenue, it was Parliament which retained control over all state taxation. From the money it raised, Parliament then made available a civil list to meet the expenses of the royal household and to pay for judges, officials and diplomats. This control over the purse strings, coupled with the passing of the Bill of Rights in 1689, meant that from that point onwards, England had for the first time a genuinely constitutional monarchy. Supreme power now resided in the king in Parliament.
Nor did it end there. The Toleration Act abolished the mechanisms that had allowed bishops and judges to enforce conformity. And the administration of justice, too, was placed above the will and whim of the sovereign. Indeed, the primacy and independence of the rule of law was one of the hallmarks of this innovative and wholly unprecedented form of government.
Court in session.
Whereas Charles II had recovered the right exercised by his father to appoint and dismiss judges at will, under the new dispensation, this was impossible. On one level, the Glorious Revolution was neither much of a revolution nor particularly glorious. On another, it was a profound shake-up of the legal and political order in England, which finally drew a line under the long conflict between king and parliament. By the time this political earthquake was over, Parliament had regained almost all the powers it had won for itself on the eve of the Civil War. The inexorable logic of the spirit behind Magna Carta, infused and propelled both by the old Anglo-Saxon love of freedom and by the tenets of the Bible, had brought England, almost despite herself, to a place where no nation had been before.
This monument to Magna Carta was set up by enthusiasts in the 20th century. Those who gathered here on 15th June 1215 to witness the sealing of that document would almost certainly have been astounded, perhaps even horrified, by the uses to which it was later put. In subsequent reigns, the Great Charter was frequently confirmed or reissued, by some counts on upwards of 40 separate occasions, the last in 1423 during the reign of Henry VI. It became almost an earnest of good intent on the part of each new king. The people who lobbied for reissue of the Charter and the kings who granted it thought they were doing no more than upholding the traditions of the past. No one was then to know that this same charter would later be used to justify a drastic reordering of the relations between ruler and subject. They would almost certainly have considered the whole idea of representative democracy unnatural, even repulsive. Such are the strange twists on which the fate of nations hangs.
Next time, science and progress, a watershed in scientific understanding that opened up new worlds and new possibilities.